And the people in the North had a very, very different view of things when considered against people in the South, for whom agriculture was most important. If you're an agriculturalist, particularly slave labor, you want high prices for food. You want cheap currency so you can get loans at the bank. You don't want to have to pay a lot of interest. That should just be enough to titillate you to the point where you can get some sense of there were differences in outlook between North and South. If you are a mercantilist, a manufacturer, a commercial person, you want stability. You want a solid currency. You want to know what the interest rate is going to be 5 years from now. Well, at least 2 years from now, or have a good idea on that. You want to know what your taxes are going to be. You want to know where the roads are going to be built. You want all of those things to be done. You want protective tariffs on manufactured goods made from outside. If you live in the South, everything is just the opposite. You want cheap money. The only roads you need are what you need to get your crops to market. You want cheap goods. You want cheap money. I hope that gives you some sense of the differences involved. These prejudices, these viewpoints, were brought to the Constitutional Convention. And at the Constitutional Convention, they generally resolved themselves into two opposing sides. That northern perspective we know as the Federalists. The southern perspective we know generally as the Anti-federalists. The Federalists did a much better job of articulating their position than did the Anti-federalists. And as a result, we probably know more and have greater detail about the thought of the great Federalists. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, or John Jay were important Federalists. Thomas Jefferson is the most famous of all of the Anti-federalists. So federalism and anti-federalism, which you need to read about and are explained quite well in your text, were then the currents that dominated at the Constitutional Convention. And they necessitated a fair amount of compromise. Now remember, a compromise is nothing else if neither side gets what it wants, totally. So a compromise is at best a temporary thing that sits and awaits further development. On page 35 in your text, there's a wonderful list of all of the major compromises that were hammered out at the Constitutional Convention, and you are responsible for each of those. The most famous that need to be dealt with is on the question of representation. Remember, it was going to be a representative government. It couldn't have been anything else. The Virginia plan, the Virginia delegation offered a plan that said representation should be done on the basis of size of the state or population. The New Jersey plan said no, every state should have an equal say in a national legislature. I can't resist saying that you see the opposition and the antagonism between Southerners and we people from New Jersey has a long historical background. It's not something that's new. It's been around a good long time. I hope we can sort of smooth it out as the term progresses. Excuse me. The result for this was the Great Compromise, brought about through the so-called Connecticut Plan, or the Connecticut Compromise, in which we settled for, both sides settled for bicameralism, 2 houses, one of which would be constructed on the basis of size of population, and the other would be another house in which there would be equality of representation. Another compromise involved the question of slavery. The larger question is who should control international commerce? The national government or the states? What should the role be? The southern states were afraid that if somehow control of commerce passed to a national government, that the slave trade would be abolished. And they had reason to think that. But the compromise was that indeed, yes, the national government would regulate commerce would regulate commerce, but there would be no interference with the trade, with the slave trade, for a period of some 20 years. On the question of representation, you've all heard of the 3/5 compromise. This is not something that we're very proud of. What it comes down to, the southern states wanted slaves to count as population, but not as property, because property was taxable. So they compromised and said that each slave will count as 3/5 of one person. The 3/5 compromise. And then, of course, the most important compromise of all is known as the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. I think if I could put it as simply as I can, the Federalist approach to governance is get the big picture right, get everything in place, and make it impossible by creating the institutions that you do for any one particular interest to dominate over all the other interests. That was the Federalist approach. We can have a big government as long as we design it in a way that puts some limits on it, and most particularly prevents any one element of that government from in any way dominating what that government does. The anti-federalist view is, well, obviously just the opposite. It is impossible, given human nature, given history, ever to change or to recapitulate I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said recapitulate. It is impossible to obviate, it is impossible to do away with, it is impossible to mollify, to change, to reduce the human tendency towards aggregation and of influence and power. And therefore you must, from the beginning, make it impossible for that to happen by law, by statute. Those were the two differences. What we have is a compromise between those two views. We are the product, as a nation, of a very, very significant, I would say brilliant, compromise. This is the American project. Is it possible for people to live in ordered liberty while maintaining security and prosperity and well-being for all? This is the American approach. I'm not saying it's better than the British or the French or the Italian or the Danish. I'm simply saying this is the American approach, and I hope that you will all bear that in mind when the subject of why we do things in a certain way comes up. You'll be able to respond in kind. Okay. I've now said so many times that you're totally sick of it, that we as a nation are the product of compromise and compromises. Some of these compromises have been pretty specific. Bill of Rights, 3/5, Connecticut Plan, all these things are pretty specific and institutional. We also compromised in certain other ways. Of these, all of them are more abstract, some are easier to explain than others. One compromise we came to is something we call separation of powers and checks and balances. Separation of powers means simply that the founders sat down and asked themselves, what does government do? What are the basic powers of government? And they came up with legislative, executive, judicial. You got to make laws, you got to enforce laws, and somebody has to say something when laws seem to conflict. Legislative, executive, judicial. Obviously, legislative is going to come first. That's the first. So we separate powers, and having separated powers, we provide to each branch of government a little bit of the power of the other branch, so that the executive can be a check on the power of the legislative, which in turn can be a check on the power of the executive, which in turn can be a check on the power of the judicial. Last hour, we discussed some of the historical influences on the founders in an effort to establish what it is historically that helps us to understand America the way we operate today in terms of our politics. We said that the founders agreed on some things and they disagreed on others. We said that each of those points of view coalesced. One we know as Federalists, the other we know as Anti-federalists. Very, very briefly, the Federalists believed in a unitary state. If you get the nation right, if you get everything organized in the right way, then the individual components that make up the nation will be in their proper place and all will be well. That was the Federalist view. The Anti-federalists had a more confederational view of what the state should be. And they argued it is impossible to get the whole thing right because you have to build from the bottom up. It has to be a confederation of states, not a confederation with all of the difficulties inherent in the Articles of Confederation government. They wanted to fix that. But they understood that there were things wrong with it. But they were very, very wary of what we call the unitary state. Now, it is not far-fetched for us to see that our politics, from the foundation to this very, very moment, represents a conflict or clash between proponents of a unitary state within certain limits and proponents of a confederate sort of state, confederative state. Indeed, we had a civil war over precisely that issue. That's really all I want to say about the difference between Federalists and Anti-federalists. In your book, in your text, there are some reprints of the more significant parts of the Federalist Papers, and you need to look at them and you need to be familiar with them. But that's really all that I wanted to say about that particular aspect, other than to remind you that what we are today is the result of a compromise, a very, very deep compromise. And by definition, a compromise is something in which neither side gets everything that particular side wants. And so you live to fight another day. And that is a way to interpret our politics. It's one I don't want to overdo, and we'll shift away from it later on. But for now, I hope you will grasp that very, very basic fact about our the nature of our political system. Compromise. The founders made a lot of compromises. Some of the compromises were pretty specific. The 3/5 compromise, you know what that is by now. The Great Compromise, you know what that is. They were specific, they were institutional, they happened, and they still exist with us. We still organize ourselves according to those terms of compromise. They were sort of unforgiving. They were mutually exclusive. They settled certain problems. They were, quote, good, unquote, compromises. We had some other compromises that were not as specific, but that were more, let's say, theoretical, more abstract in nature. And some of these things were difficult and continue to give us difficulties today. We talk about separation of powers and checks and balances. I wonder if we all know what that means. First of all, separation of powers and checks and balances always go together. There's no point in separating powers if you don't somehow also use that separation to check others. Basically, what the founders did was say, what does government have to do? And they said, well, it has to make laws, the legislature. It has to implement laws, the executive. And it must judge things when the laws are in conflict, or when conflict grows out of that, the judicial. There are three branches of government. Executive, legislative always comes first, executive, and judicial. Isn't it interesting? As a political scientist, I have been trained to say legislative, executive, judicial. As a citizen who reads the newspapers every day, I invariably put the executive first, which speaks volumes about the way the relationship has changed. And we'll pick up on that as we go along. In any case, you separate the powers, but you give to each branch of government a little bit of the power of the other branch. The legislature makes laws. The executive can veto them. The legislature can override a veto. The judicial can declare a law unconstitutional. All of that came later. That illustrates the principle of checks and balances. The executive puts a check on legislative power. The legislative puts a check on executive power. And the judicial puts a check on all of them, except you remember that both the executive and legislative are involved in the creation of the system in the first place. Now, that's the principle. I really don't want to spend a whole lot of time going through and finding and citing example after example after example of checks and balances. There's plenty of that in your text, and I think that you'll pick that up as we go along. But let me just say just a couple of things on that subject. Article 1 in the Constitution. Read your Constitution. Article 1 is all about the legislature and the Congress. It has 10 sections. It spells out very clearly what the Congress can do. It says what the states can do. And it makes certain provisions because the Senate is elected by state legislatures. It makes certain that money bills must originate in the House. In other words, in every case, there is a check to see that the power that is vested in the particular organization cannot be concentrated, cannot be used to overwhelm, because if they do attempt to exceed their bounds, they'll bump into an establishment of the Constitution by other branches of government. Article 2 talks about the executive. Well, the executive is elected by an electoral college. Conceivably, this is giving some of you some problems. What do we mean by the electoral vote and the popular vote? Let me just take a minute to talk about that. Because in the case of our present president, that has very much been an issue. When you vote for the President of the United States, you don't actually vote for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or RonMontaperto, how's my last name spelled, by the way, or Ed Leidenberger or anybody else. What you do is you vote for electors who are pledged to vote for those candidates. Now, who are the electors? The electors are men and women of substance who are involved in local politics, either in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, and so have some reputation. And they meet on a particular day and they cast their votes as they have been committed to do. Therefore, it's possible to win the electoral votes. It's possible to gain a majority of electoral votes while not having a majority of popular votes, which, despite his denials to that effect, is what happened with President Trump. He did receive a number of electoral votes. Why? Because he captured majorities of electoral votes in states that have a large number of electoral votes. How do you get to be a large number of electoral votes? It's equivalent to the number of representatives you have in Congress. A place like Nevada, 2 senators, maybe 2 congressmen, 4 electoral votes. A place like California, 2 senators, 35 congressmen, 37 electoral votes. I just made that up out of my head. I'm not sure that it's right. But I wanted to say something about the notion of electoral votes. You look at Article 3, the judicial power. The judicial power is such that judges are appointed by the president, but they are confirmed by the Senate. All of this illustrates the notion of checks and balances. I'd like you to go a little further in your reading and be able to give more and deeper examples of those things.